Today, we're going to go over 8 reasons why your combats are boring and ways we can go about fixing that. Number 1, the combat environment is boring. It doesn't matter if you're fighting at the bottom of an ancient temple hidden underground. It doesn't matter if you're high up in the mountain of the gods. If the combat is all taking place on a 25 by 25 grid with nothing on it. If your environment is telling a tale and it's so descriptive and so awesome, and yet when it comes down to initiative, the environment doesn't matter at all, then it's an issue. Then it's boring. Because once again, you're fighting on the top of this ancient mountain. You know, it should be awesome. There should be a whole bunch of spires somewhere that affect line of sight. There should be lightning being called down. If you're fighting an ancient temple, there should be ruinous rubble that's all over the place and maybe tripping people up. If you're fighting on a ship, then there should be a whole bunch of rope everywhere, and there should be a whole bunch of confined spaces. Think about how the environment affects the combat, because if you just lay out a boring combat map and the environment doesn't change how the combat is played out at all, then it's going to be boring. Number 2, the objective is the same. Now, what is the objective of combat normally? It's to reduce the enemies down to 0 HP. Unfortunately, if that is the objective of combat every single time, it's going to get real stale if you always have the procedure of needing to drop the enemy down to 0. You need to think about other objectives when there is combat. Maybe there should be some sort of timer in regards of you need to run away, or you need to save someone in X time. You need to press the big red button to stop the detonation of that magical nuke that's about to hit the city. Instead of it being dropping the enemy down to 0 HP, maybe you're just trying to slow them down. Maybe it's the enemy that's running away, and you need to prevent them from reaching their destination. Whether you're trying to touch an objective, trying to reach an objective, trying to prevent the enemy from reaching an objective, you need to have other objectives in the combat other than just reducing down the enemy to 0. Number 3, the players use the same options. Why does the wizard cast Fireball every single time there is combat? It's because it's strong. But here's the issue. If all they ever do is cast Fireball, that's going to get real stale, because it just ends up being the minutia of get into combat, cast Fireball, rinse, repeat. You need to think about how you can force the players to do something else. Use some other sort of option. If you have someone that's constantly casting Fireball, then there needs to be some sort of reason why they can't cast Fireball in a certain scenario. Not to play against them, but to ensure that there is at least a variety in the game. For the instance of Fireball, that could be they're in an environment filled with gas, and if they cast Fireball, then the whole place goes kablooey. If the Paladin just blows all their spell slots on smites, then maybe give them a reason to actually cast their spells throughout the course of the adventuring day. Is the Bard always casting Hold Person? Maybe the monster casts Hold Person on the Bard. The players are going to do whatever they think is effective, and if you always present the same scenario that can always be beaten the same way, they're going to be doing the same thing over and over, and that's going to lead to less and less fun. Number 4, the monsters are boring. Look at this stat block. That stat block should be impactful. That stat block should have a whole bunch of things that tells you about how to run the monster and how to make it fun for not only yourself to run, but for your players to engage with. But as I'm looking at that stat block, it is boring. It is huge, but it's also bare at the same time. Now take, for example, my own spin on the stat block. Right there, boom, adding a whole bunch of options, adding variety, not only for myself, but for my players. My players don't know what they're going to get into. I might not even know what they're getting into. So right there on that stat block, not only should we add more actions to these creatures to have a variety in the combat, but more importantly, you should be thinking about what the monster is doing outside of its stat block. Think about what it could be thinking. The ooze is unintelligent. The ooze is just going to simply shamble forward. But the human bandit, that human bandit has thinking. That human bandit could in fact be smarter than a whole bunch of the player characters. Some monsters, it makes sense that you run them one note. But there's a whole bunch of other monsters that should be ran a whole bunch of different ways to allow there to be a whole bunch of variety in the game. And if you are looking for monsters with fun variants, then check out No Fun's Guide to Everything, a monthly magazine filled with a whole bunch of goodies for DMs and players alike. Inside you'll find a whole bunch of unique variants on monsters, new features, new spells, new items, and so much more. Number 5, it doesn't add to the adventure. Now, while you might have a good combat, at the end of the day, after the session, your players may be asking the question, did that actually add anything to the adventure? Did it add anything to the session? Did your players just face a random encounter, and this was random encounter number 7 that you just simply rolled up? Or was this integral to the plot and to the character development? Now, this is going to differ from table to table, but some tables may not appreciate random encounters because it doesn't add anything to the adventure, and it in fact actually takes away from the adventure because you're spending more time on things people don't care about. At the same time, if it is story related, but the combat is completely superfluous, it doesn't add anything, the enemy always gets away, or your players are able to wrap up the combat in an instant, then once again, did it add anything to the adventure? Think about the tone, theme, and setting for your adventure, and if the combat should be included or not. Is it going to take away from the adventure, or is it going to enhance the adventure? Number 6, the stakes aren't high enough. What are the consequences for getting into this combat, and what are the consequences if your players do not succeed at this combat? Think about the consequences, because combat should be scary. There should be some sort of taxation on the characters because of this combat, whether that be in their resources, whether that be in time, whether that be in whatever the case may be. They may be losing something from this experience. If the combat is simply one random encounter a day as they travel down the road and they get back all the resources on a long rest and the combat doesn't add anything to the adventure, think about how low those stakes are, about how the combats are simply win or lose, and if they win, then nothing happens, but if they lose, then they lose everything. Those are not good stakes. Those are pretty boring stakes. The stakes aren't high enough. Think about combats where your players have to defend an objective, where right there, the stakes are high. They have to defend this objective, and if that objective gets taken out, whether this be a friendly NPC or some sort of magical artifact or something, then you have right there the lasting implications. If they fail to protect something, then that will spill over into the rest of the adventure. If your players are chasing after the enemy bandit that stole something, and if they fail to catch that person, that means a magical artifact gets let loose, then guess what? The stakes are high, because if they fail that objective, then boom, there is now a magical artifact in the world, and it's going to get in the hands of somebody else. Conversely, if you're going for the old school style approach, then make every random encounter matter because your resource management matters. If you have 8 encounters in a day, then the stakes are incredibly high because you need to ensure that you do not drop down to 0 HP because then it's going to really suck. Make the stakes matter, make them clear and present to everybody at the table so that they know exactly what they're getting into and how they best prepare for it. Number 7, the combat is predictable. Now, I've already talked about players doing the same thing, and we've talked about monsters being boring, but I'm talking about the implication of combat. If your players know exactly how the story beats work of your players show up to a destination, they get into a fight, then they go to another location, they get into another fight, then the combat is predictable. We do not want there to be predictability in combat. While yes, there's plenty of times in a story where it makes perfect sense, where your players meet the villain, and the villain monologues and a combat ensues, that's fine. But if every single combat is seen a mile ahead of time, not because of any sort of in-game implication, but because of just your players knowing how you run the game, then it's a big deal. You have to think about the flow of the adventure in regards of how the combat is approached. When does combat happen? Do your players always know ahead of time that combat's always going to happen if they do this one exact thing, if they go to this one exact area? Then it's going to get boring. Make combat unpredictable. Make them get ambushed. Make them fall prey to combat. Maybe they stumble into combat and they themselves get to dictate if the combat is predictable or not. Allow for there to be that autonomy in the world and make sure that combat isn't always seen ahead of time. Number 8, the party is predetermined to win. Typically when we run these games, we are running for people that want to be awesome action heroes, where they want to be the big stars, where they want to be the legends. But the issue I see a lot is the predictability of winning. It seems as if no matter what the players say and do over the course of their combat, they are going to win. They're going to win the fight, they're going to win the adventure. While it's good to win occasionally, the main issue comes if you have nothing but wins time and time and time again. Winning becomes hollow. If you have losses thrown in the mix, that's going to make the wins matter that much more. Don't wave your hand and say that the players are predetermined to win every sort of engagement. Think about what happens if they lose, because they should lose. If they get captured, if they lose a party member, whatever happens, that adds to a whole bunch of flavor in the adventure. Subvert their expectations by doing something that they didn't think was possible. Them being able to lose, but them being able to seek their redemption and win again. And for the love of all that's holy, don't have Deus Ex Machinas just pop out of thin air every single time the players are about to lose, because they're going to notice it, and they're going to know in the back of their minds that winning is just completely worthless. So that was 8 reasons why your combats are boring and ways we can fix that. If you want to see more of the things I was talking about in this video, then check out my Patreon and go to No Fun's Guide to Everything, where I'm releasing monthly a whole bunch of materials for you to use. And that includes player options, that includes DM options, and a whole bunch of fun goodies for your table. In addition to that, I also release maps on a weekly basis, so check out those. So do you feel like your combats are boring? Was the thing that made it boring listed here, or was I missing it? Go ahead and tell me down below. I would love to hear it. But that's going to do it for me. Thank you for watching. Thanks for listening. And thank you to my amazing patrons. You guys are absolutely incredible. Thank you so very much. And I cannot wait to see you all in the next one. You know, I've ran a lot of boring combat in my time. But thankfully, much like with everything, you eventually get better at it. But what really helps out too is feedback. Talk to your players about, was that combat entertaining, yes or no? And then you can finally dial in on what your particular group wants.